Today we're going to be talking about two brewers and a new category of brewing called no-bypass brewing. Now, if you're not familiar with no-bypass brewing, don't worry, we will explain that very quickly, but let me introduce you to the two things that we're looking at today. We have the Tricolate brewer and we have the next level brewer. There were no-bypass brewers for ages, and then suddenly there's two. It's a bit like when there's movies that seem to be the same movie but released at the same time, like movies about asteroids or magicians or volcanoes, or you know what I'm talking about. But before we evaluate these two brewers, I do want to get into the concept very quickly of no-bypass brewing. What is it? Why is it important? Why should you care? Do you want another brewer in your life? It's a concept around pour-over coffee. Now, if you take a traditional pour-over cone, like this one, when you brew a pour-over with this, you have a bed of coffee at the bottom of the cone, you're pouring water in the top, and most of that water flows through the bed of coffee, dragging with it the delicious soluble flavors down into the cup below. But some of the water finds it easier to kind of go sideways through the paper filter and around the bed of coffee because the coffee is providing quite a lot of resistance. That water doesn't really get involved in the brewing process, and we call that water bypass water. It's not a huge issue, we should be aware of it, our techniques should allow for it, but it doesn't make it impossible to brew good coffee with a pour-over brewer. But what if you didn't have bypass? That's the question that these brewers are trying to answer. And if more of the water went through the coffee, then you'd have more solubles taken out of the coffee down into the cup below. And so the idea behind no-bypass brewing is to let you do a more effective and efficient extraction. You'll get more solubles out of your ground coffee. And that will also mean that the cup below would be comparatively stronger. You've got more stuff in that water, the cup's going to taste stronger. There are other brewers that are zero bypass. An AeroPress is zero bypass. Espresso is zero bypass. You have a kind of column of water passing through a puck or a bed of coffee. And that's the way that these are going to work too. By not allowing the water to escape through the sides, by forcing it down through the coffee as the only escape route, you have this zero bypass effect. But if you make coffee with an espresso machine or an AeroPress, you know that water without a little encouragement doesn't really want to go through the coffee bed. You've got to add some pressure. Otherwise, it takes a really long time. And that's part of brewing with these brewers. All the things you think about with brew time are going to go out of the window. Here, your brews may take anywhere from 5 minutes up to 10 minutes in some cases. So if you're in a rush, that might disqualify these brewers straight away, but don't throw them out just yet, because the coffee you get by extracting more does taste different. It doesn't just taste stronger, it tastes different, because if you take a sort of a high extraction brew and you just dilute it back to normal strength, it doesn't taste identical with a normal, traditional kind of pour-over brew. So you have to first decide, do you want this new style of coffee? Not that you have to do that. I will say these brewers allow you to brew lower extraction yields if you want to, but the trick of them, the unique part of them, is that they let you brew these higher extractions. So if you look at each of these brewers, you'll see that their approach to the problem is pretty much identical. Now, the Tricolate, I think, is the earlier brewer. I think it started development in 2018. I heard about it in 2020, and I heard about the next level brewer here in 2021. And pricing-wise, they're both around $50 to $60 depending on where in the world you are, and shipping and all the rest of it. But the way they work is simple. You will have, in the bottom here, a filter bed where your paper will go, and you'll put your coffee on top of the filter paper and make it nice and even. And then you'll put these little shower screens on top, pour water on top, and they will help distribute the water evenly across the coffee bed, and that column of water will build up and then drain down. They're kind of the same, but they have a couple of key differences that will really inform which one of these might be the best for you. So what we'll do now is brew some coffee with them, and then we can drink some coffee, talk about the high extraction yield stuff, talk about the sort of nitpicks of these brewers, and then at the end of it, you'll know if you need one of these in your life, and if you do, which one fits you. Now I'll start with the Tricolate first, and I'm going to brew differently in each one for a reason. The kind of philosophical idea behind each brewer is slightly separate. If you look at the kind of way that they want you to use their brewer, then Tricolate are pushing one particular angle a little harder. The idea basically, you can use and should use way less coffee. So instead of using 60 grams a litre that you might use in a pour over, here we're going to use 45 grams per litre. That's a kind of big selling point. If you think about how much coffee you might save over the course of a year by dropping from 60 grams a litre to 45, then you can pretty quickly work out that you might save the cost of the brewer within 150 or 200 cups, depending on the cost of your coffee. Now, the construction of the brewer is very simple. You have this base piece that does actually come out like that and sort of snaps back into place. You don't really need to take it out other than for cleaning occasionally, but you absolutely want to make sure it's locked back in properly. To get a filter paper in, they say just drop one in the top. This whole process might require slightly more patience than I sometimes have, if I'm honest. And then you would want to rinse the paper once it's settled at the bottom and make sure that it is properly seated right in the middle and all the edges are nice and flush. So I've got 15 grams of coffee here. I'm going to grind it relatively finely, finer than I would grind for a pour over, quite substantially, but not espresso fine, but certainly much finer than pour over. And I'll be brewing in total about 333 grams of water into that. With both of these brewers, you have to be quite thoughtful about prepping the bed of coffee before you brew. It needs to be as level and even as possible. If you've got a very fancy grinder, life's probably all well and good, but with cheaper grinders, because you're grinding that bit finer, clumping may be an issue. And so I would recommend potentially getting out your little WDT tool, if you have one of those, just to declump your coffee before you brew it if your grinder does kick out some clumps at these finer grind settings. Now, I've seen recipes for the Tricolate that go as low as 10 or 12 grams of coffee, and that's interesting. That's a good thing. That's a very shallow bed. And the way that you're going to deal with this will vary slightly depending on the bed depth. You want to kind of mess with it less the thinner the bed is, generally speaking. Here we have a sort of small to medium bed of 15 grams. And for 15 grams, I'm going to add about 45 grams of bloom water, a very gentle swirl to mix. Wait 30-35 seconds, and then I'm going to add the rest of the brew water. And then once that's added, one more gentle swirl. And I will say the nice thing about both of these brewers is that you don't need a fancy pouring kettle. You can just use a regular kettle if that's what you have at home. But what you can quite clearly see is a bed of coffee at the bottom and a column of water above it. And that's just going to move down and through. And that's going to take a while. This brew might take 5.5 minutes to complete. And so while it's doing that, we may as well talk about the next brewer. So the next level encourages you in a different route around your brewing. It says grind 30 grams, so like a much bigger dose is your sort of recommended dose, and grind a little coarser than you would do here. The goal actually is to use less water in the brew. So we're going to brew half a litre, but only about 360 grams of the water, maybe 370, are going to go through the coffee. And because that gives us a higher yield, but we stop earlier, we'll get pretty close to a kind of normal extraction of 20-21%, and we'll just dilute that down to kind of normal drinking strength afterwards. So it's a philosophically very different approach. You can brew identically to this, right? You can brew finer, higher yields, do all of the same sort of stuff here, but it just seemed worth brewing the way they encourage you to brew, to kind of compare and contrast. So prepping this brewer is a little bit different. So the sort of side walls of the brewer actually come off. And then you're going to place your filter on top of that, and then you're going to give it a little rinse. Then you're going to put the brewer together. And then we add the coffee. And now this is quite a bit coarser. This is close to where I would grind for a 2-cup pour over, which is what they recommend. The interesting implication is that I'm going to use 25% less water. So to get the same extraction, does that imply that a V60 has about 25% bypass? Maybe. If you're wondering why this is suddenly brewed and this took me so long, there's a reason for that. I too constantly wonder if I've had too much or not enough caffeine. So a really very similar process. Boiling water, 3 times the weight, so we're going to do a 90-gram bloom. Give it a gentle swirl. And then after a short bloom phase, we're going to get up to about 380 grams of water in, maybe 370. The rest we'll add in the brew afterwards. In all brewing, excessive agitation seems to cause some clogging, so you kind of want to do the least possible agitation to get what you want at the end, which is a flat bed of coffee. And I will say, with both of these brewers, if you have an obsession around flat beds with pour-over brewers, that kind of gets worse with these, where you really interrogate the flatness of everything. Obviously, to have these be level when you're brewing is really important. That will help you get a flat bed. So, just be mindful of your setup. Don't have things at an angle. Make sure everything's put into place properly. That stuff does have a noticeable impact on taste. Undrinkable. So your bed at the end should be relatively flat, even. You shouldn't have too much kind of stuff to freak out about. With the Tricolate, give it a knock, and most of it comes out pretty cleanly. You'll then need to rinse this stuff out, pop out the base if you want to do that. But to clean, fine. Not incredible, but perfectly fine. The next level encourages you to take off this piece before knocking out, like so. You still need to clean this. That doesn't shortcut that part of the process. And then this should knock out relatively easily. You'll see that this is a white piece here, and it's slightly kind of porous as a material, which means that you do get some staining and discoloration with the white version of this brewer. It's kind of a weird choice. You can get aggressive in the cleaning and sort of undo a bit of that, but over time this will certainly stain and discolor. Now I owe this brew another about 120 mils of water. So now we've got two similar cups of coffee in terms of strength, but very different cups in terms of extraction. Here, low dose, high extraction to get to our kind of normal strength of filter coffee. And here we had that high extraction but with less water and then some bypass sort of done separately to get us to a normal strength from a normal dose. So this is the kind of more unusual cup, that kind of high extraction yield. Typically this coffee and this setup has been extracting 24 to 25%, sometimes a little bit more. And here, a kind of normal brew achieved in an unusual way. And it's interesting in that they have similar strength and in some ways similar texture. Here, it feels like there's a lot more going on, but to the point that it feels a bit like a crowded room sometimes. You don't have the kind of clarity, I start to get into pretentious words here, but the kind of clarity of acidity or of some of the flavors, but you get a lot of texture in an interesting way and you get a lot of flavor. It's just harder for me to pick it apart. In the lower extraction brew, you maybe miss out on a little bit of sweetness, you miss out on a little bit of texture, but what's there kind of has a bit more space. And that's pleasant. I think it certainly suits some coffees more than others. I will say now, and I think this is important, that I think you could achieve broadly the same extractions with both brewers, right? If you started with the same coffee, I'm not sure if you got them both to 23.5%, I'm not sure I could taste the difference between which one was which. You know what I mean? I think they brew in a technically very, very, very similar way. You could have made this cup with this brewer and vice versa. Let's get to summaries before I talk too much. The fundamental difference between the two of them seems a little simplistic, but it's ultimately size. This is a bigger brewer, and that changes the use cases for it compared to this brewer. Because what attracts me to higher extraction yields are the efficiencies of it, right? And there's certainly times when I've got maybe 12 grams of coffee left at the bottom of a bag. With this brewer, I can just make a bigger cup of coffee with it quite easily. I probably couldn't get 12 grams to work as easily in a brewer like this, but if I need to brew larger volumes of liquid, this is a better brewer. If I'm brewing for two thirsty people, this maybe isn't as well suited to that as the next level. In terms of design, I enjoy some aspects of the next level more. It feels a little bit more premium, aside from the fact that it does discolor. I like the idea of kind of pulling the brew chamber off to make sure that the paper is seated first and then placing the chamber on top. Sort of dropping the paper into here, potentially using the back of a spoon to poke it around as they recommend if it's not quite seated, is a less joyful experience. Now, both brewers can feel a little bit finicky. That's kind of a shared attribute of these kind of no-bypass brewers. They feel frustrating sometimes in that the brews can be quite slow and you'll have maybe waited 4.5 minutes to work out that your grind isn't entirely where you want it to be, as it's either finished or is nowhere near finished at that point. They're slow enough that I don't want to reach for them every single day, but I do think they're interesting options to have around as part of your kind of brewer collection. I think there are certain coffees that lend themselves better towards these high yield things. I think coffees with tons of sweetness that aren't overly developed in the roast do better, and the more developed a coffee is in the roast, the kind of lower overall extraction I'd be aiming for. Now, it interests me that the recommended dose here is about 30 grams, because if you take the diameter of the sort of brewer and scale that dose down to this, well, that's like a 20-ish gram dose on this brewer. which, they claim to be able to brew half that amount. So I don't know, with a bit of skill and effort, if you could get good results from smaller doses. But I think in both cases, the thinner the bed, the harder it is to get a very even result, not to have channeling issues, not to have it be a bit of a finicky, fussy experience, especially when you want to be manipulating those, swirling those less with those kind of smaller doses. Now, what we haven't done today in this video is get into recommended techniques. Is there a perfect way of using these? That isn't really something I wanted to address in this video. I wanted to kind of cover the concepts of no bypass, to look at these two brewers in a kind of objective way. There are recommendations on YouTube. I'll leave some links to both the official ones and some other creators who have some interesting recipes and ideas around these brewers, should you want to explore them further. As for which one I would pick, kind of both or neither. I sort of want a hybrid of the two to exist. I want some of the sort of design features and ease of use around this incorporated into this, probably closer to this in size. I just want the kind of paper bit of this to be slightly more joyful and it to feel maybe a little bit more premium. It's not bad in its construction, and it's a good food-safe plastic, but it just doesn't quite have the kind of premium feel of this. Though saying that, they do other colorways of the Tricolate. They have this kind of nice orangey one. They do a kind of very blue one that's kind of intense. I quite like this color. I think it's pretty nice. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you own one of these brewers? Do you even own both? Do you have a favorite? Does your experience match with mine, or did you have a very different one to me? I want to hear from you down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.